So I'm going to try and do Mission Impossible here and get a ceasefire between the new atheist community and the progressive community. Now, before I continue here, let me just say, from day one, I've kind of proclaimed that I'm in both camps. So there's this hard line and this divide between the different groups now. And I've always kind of said, well, on that point, I agree with the new atheists. Well, but on that point, I agree with the progressives. And, you know, at times I feel like I'm the only guy who's saying that. But then oftentimes when I release segments on this topic, I see that a lot of people in my audience actually kind of agree as well, and they find themselves in the middle. And it just so happens that many new atheists are progressives, and many progressives are new atheists as well. So at times I feel like I'm the only one that is advocating for this middle ground position, but then my own audience, I guess, comes to the rescue and says, we're kind of with you on that too, which would make sense. I mean, you listen to my show, so that means you're probably more inclined to agree with me. I mean, I guess there's a tiny percentage of people who watch the show who just hate everything I say, and they watch it so that they can get red in the face and go, stop it. But anyway, I'm going to be very, very critical here of both sides, and I'm going to do that because I think it's merited, because I think this beef between the two camps is actually really, really silly and unnecessary. So, I have 5 points where I'm criticizing the new atheist side, 5 points where I'm criticizing the progressive side, and basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying, if the two sides can agree to just these 5 things each, well, then we can kind of move forward here and not have this ridiculous bickering fight continue. Again, I don't think it's going to happen at this point because people in both camps hate the other camp so much now, but I think it's worth a shot, and I think it's necessary to do just for accuracy's sake. And I'm curious to see if everybody listening here kind of agrees with my criticisms of both sides. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, I'm going to focus on the progressives first and criticize the progressives first, and then I'll get to the new atheists. And by the way, I don't care what camp you're in, but if you are in one of the camps and you're a hardliner in that camp, just hear out both sides here and see if you agree where I'm coming from and see if you agree with my criticisms of both sides. So don't get your feelings up too much here. If you're solidly in the progressive camp and you think, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. Or if you're in the new atheist camp and you said, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. Just listen, okay? So, first to the progressives, what I would say is point number 1. Try to abide by what I call the 50% rule. Now, this is a goofy rule I made up for myself, and I try to stick to it as well, and the idea behind it is, if you agree with somebody on 50% of things or more, that person is not worthy of the same level of scorn that you would give to a character like Rush Limbaugh or Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or Michelle Bachmann or Sarah Palin, or people that are just fucking buffoons. So if you look at SecularTalk clips, when I go after the ultra-conservatives, of course I go after them and I mock them and I hammer them and I go to town because I think it's merited. We basically disagree on 100% of things, and I know I'm not wrong on 100% of things, so I have a leeway to crack down, okay? And it makes sense to do so, and I think the audience agrees. But when it comes to somebody who you know you agree with on over 50% of issues, when you try to treat that person with the same level of scorn that you would treat somebody like Sarah Palin, that's just silly. That just doesn't make sense because you're glossing over nuance. And, you know, it's just you're not being as accurate as you should be. Okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2 is, I would really like it if progressives criticized the doctrine of Islam as much as they criticize the doctrine of Christianity. Now, I understand, and many people understand, why it is you don't do that, because there aren't as many Muslims in America, and you feel more responsible for the Christian fundamentalists and the neoconservatives than you do for Muslim extremism. But either way, for objectivity's sake, if we can all agree, and most of us do, that the religions are false, they're incorrect, and you're not part of the groups, well then, take the doctrines, like we always cite Bible verses in Christianity that are fucking idiotic. But we don't do it nearly as much for Islam, and we should. We can talk about, the flying horse and the yellow cow in Islam, and the fact that slavery's in Islam, and all the passages kill the infidel. We should get into just as much specifics against the doctrine of Islam as we do against Christianity. Okay, that's point number 2. I hope they're with me so far here. Point number 3 is, don't brush over important caveats of new atheists and also make distinction among new atheists. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I talk about caveats, don't brush over important caveats of new atheists, I'm referring to stuff like when Sam Harris writes about torture and nuclear strikes. What did he actually say in those arguments? Well, he said, when it comes to torture, I think it should be illegal, full stop. That's important. That's an important distinction. You have to say that. Then he goes on to say, well, in the hypothetical ticking time bomb scenario, I think it can be ethically justified. That's basically his argument. Now, I disagree with that argument. I think that torture doesn't work, as has been proven, and you become the devil you're trying to avoid when you do torture. So those actions are inherently wrong, and they're wrong when we do it or when Al-Qaeda does it, right? So I disagree with that argument, but I don't just, when I'm talking about that argument, I don't just say, Sam Harris believes in torture. Because that's not true. You're not being accurate when you say that. So don't gloss over all the caveats and the hedges and the nuance among the new atheists. To give you another example, the nuclear strike. Sam Harris has explained, well, what I mean is, if Osama bin Laden takes over a country and he has his own nukes and he can press a red button, perhaps then we should consider a counter-nuclear strike. That's the argument he makes. But it's boiled down in some progressive circles where they say, Sam Harris believes in a nuclear strike. But again, that's not accurate. You're not giving all of the facts behind it, which make it seem significantly more reasonable than you're leading on. Now, again, I still disagree with that. Why? Because I think it makes sense to, as a matter of principle, rule out using nuclear weapons, because you're gonna have a lot of civilian casualties if you do. And if you kill civilians, you become the bad guy. Okay? So again, my point is here, you can still disagree with Sam Harris, but you can disagree respectfully, and you can acknowledge what his real argument is. And unfortunately, you don't see that in a lot of progressive circles. They'll just say, Sam Harris believes in torture, Sam Harris believes in nukes, and here's another one that they say, which is not true. They say, oh, he believes in profiling. Well, did you read his argument on profiling? He says he believes in, you ready for this? Anti-profiling. And he goes on to explain, and what I mean by that is, don't frisk 8-year-old girls and don't frisk 90-year-old grandmas. That's basically it. That's his argument. So again, when progressives say he believes in profiling, he believes in torture, he believes in nuclear first strikes, you're not being accurate. You're not being accurate when you say that. Okay. Now, when I say make distinctions among new atheists, what I mean by that is you can't just lump them all in. So one of the things that progressives do is they'll say, well, you know the new atheist crowd like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Bill Maher, and then they'll go on to, slam them with something. But what are they forgetting? Or what are they not doing? They're not making distinctions where they say, well, actually, you can't say that Sam Harris and Bill Maher agree on everything, because they don't. Bill Maher, for example, has been against every Middle East intervention. So if you lump him in with, somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who was for the Iraq War and is also a new atheist, you're not being accurate, because Bill Maher is significantly more liberal than Christopher Hitchens was on many issues at the end of his life. And you can't lump in Bill Maher with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, because, again, she's in favor of some more conservative policies than he is. So you can't just say new atheists and that's it. You have to be specific in differentiating among new atheists. And by the way, if you aren't, then you're guilty of the same thing that you say new atheists are guilty of when it comes to Muslims. Well, you say, well, the problem with new atheists is that they generalize about Muslims. Yeah, but then you're generalizing about new atheists if you lump them all in and you say, wow, come on, they're really conservative. That doesn't make any sense. Penn, for example, is also a new atheist. He's a hardcore libertarian. He's a committed non-interventionist. There's differences of opinion when it comes to policy positions among the new atheists. And overall, if you had to measure what their positions are, they lean heavily on the liberal side. So don't just, paint them all with a broad brush and say they are X. They're not. Okay, next. And this one, it feeds into the last one as well. Stop calling them neocons. They're not neocons. You know what a neocon is? Dick Cheney. You know what a neocon is? George Bush. You know what a neocon is? Donald fucking Rumsfeld. If you actually believe that Sam Harris or Bill Maher or Richard Dawkins are as dumb and wrong as Dick Cheney or George Bush, that's ridiculous. You simply have not read their books if you think that's the case, or you have not listened to them talk. Bill Maher has been the toughest ever on George Bush and Dick Cheney. He could not be more tough on them. Okay, and again, go through the policy positions that, okay, they're all in favor of abortion, they're all in favor of being economically liberal, they're all in favor of gay rights. You simply can't say that that's like George Bush and Dick Cheney. It's not. So stop calling them neocons. It's not true. It's not accurate. Okay, next. Admit, and this is the final one here, admit that sometimes the root problem is religious doctrine. Now, here's where, the common counter-argument is, but Kyle, it's more geopolitics, it's more economics, it's more psychology, it's more oppression, etc., which leads to religious radicalization and or terrorism. That's the argument. It's economics, it's politics, it's psychology, it's this and that leads to terrorism and religious radicalization. And my response to that is, yes, sometimes, absolutely, abso-frickin-lutely. But sometimes, no. Sometimes it really is the religious doctrine. And see, Reza says, for example, people like to insert their values into religion. That's true. Many, many times that's true. But sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes people derive their values from religion. And you have somebody who was otherwise normal, raised to believe a fundamentalist interpretation of a holy book, and they read kill the infidel, behead this person, behead that person, and then they did it! So sometimes the root problem is the religion. There's this idea now that, it can never be the religion. Why? Why can it never be the religion? Of course it could be the religion sometimes. So, to give an example of that, Charlie Hebdo. They said, we're doing it because we think, according to our religion, you can't draw a picture of the prophet, and you did. Now we're going to kill you. That's purely religious, man! And, it happens with Christianity. It happens with all types of religions and all types of ideologies and doctrines where it's somebody actually believes it and they act on it. Okay, so that's what I want the progressives to admit to. And if they admit to those things, well then, they've done their part. Now let's go to the criticism of the new atheists and say what they have to, concede. Now, up to this point, the new atheists were probably like, yay, Kyle's awesome. He's saying all the right things. But now you're going to get mad at me because now I'm going to criticize you. Okay. So, to the new atheists, you also have to abide by the 50% rule, which means if you agree with somebody on 50% of things or more, treat them with more respect than you would some buffoon that you disagree with on 100% of things who you know is an idiot. If you're a new atheist and you dislike Reza Aslan or Glenn Greenwald, okay, but you know that they deserve your intellectual respect because you know they believe what they're saying and you know they have arguments to back it up. You might not agree with all their arguments, but you know they're more intelligent than you're pretending if you act like they're some sort of buffoons. They're not buffoons. Glenn Greenwald did something historic and heroic with the NSA. And these are people, again, who you might not even realize it, but you agree with on well over 50% of things. So you also don't just dismiss them and act like they're nefarious, or Sam Harris likes to say about Reza Aslan, he's sinister. Don't say that because that's also not true. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two. Acknowledge, now, some people in the new atheist movement, to varying degrees, they have acknowledged this. But I'm going to go into specifics here. So I would say acknowledge that anti-Muslim bigotry is real. Now, don't just say it when you're pressed on it, because sometimes that's what Sam Harris will do. Like Cenk, in the interview with him, pressed him on it, said, well, do you understand that this is a problem? Or actually, it was at Real Time with Bill Maher, where Sam admitted, of course there's bigotry against Muslims as people, and I'm not for that. So he admits it when pressed on it. But here's what I want, man. I want you to tell me something about it specifically, so I know you're not just saying that so that you can continue to only bash them. You see what I mean? So in other words, tell me some hate crime statistics. Every once in a while, tweet an article that says, hey, here's some anti-Muslim bigotry that's real and it's a problem and we should address it. Talk to me about media bias. Dylan Roof did a terrorist attack and nobody called him a terrorist. Why? He's a white guy and he was a neo-Confederate, so, well, that doesn't count as terrorism. But it does! It absolutely does, and it is terrorism. But nobody in the media called it terrorism. But when it's a Muslim, immediately they go, terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Talk to me about that, new atheists. You know that double standard exists. Acknowledge it. Talk about it. Go into details about it. Talk about how mosques and cemeteries in America are repeatedly blocked, even though it's unconstitutional and you can't do that. But they block it because when Muslims want it, they don't get the same treatment that Christians do oftentimes in this country. Tell me about that. Give me specific examples. Tweet an article every once in a while. Talk about Peter King's terrorism hearings, where he had a terrorism hearing in America, and it was only about Muslim terrorism. Even though as a raw number, there are more right-wing terrorist attacks. And that segues into the second part of this same point here, which is know your facts on right-wing terrorism. Be able to tell me that it's a big problem. Now, I know that you guys all believe, and you can say, well, statistically in the world today, Muslim terrorism is worse. Okay, fair enough. But show me that you give a fuck when it's the right-wingers who do the terrorism, because it's not like they don't do it, and it's not like it's a non-issue. 56% of terrorist attacks in America and attempted terrorist attacks are done by right-wingers. Tell me that you know that. Tell me that you care about that. Okay? Don't always use that as a point to belittle it, like belittle the right-wing terror, and then go back to talking about how evil the Muslim terror is. Show me that you actually give a fuck about the right-wing terror. Again, they'll bring it up every once in a while, but it's never like, oh, and here's some specifics on that. I don't think they know or care to bring up the specifics, because I think they do want to focus only on the Muslim terrorism. I don't want you to do that, because that doesn't appear to be intellectually honest when you're saying, well, belittle this one and move on to the next one. And you can say the opposite for the liberals too. You can focus on the Islamic terrorism, focus on it. And, don't always say, but right-wing terrorism, but Christian terrorism. All I want is objectivity on this one. Okay, next. Understand that violence for power and control and imperialism and natural resources, etc., is more prevalent, okay, and equally immoral to religious violence. So, that's very important, because oftentimes you'll hear some people in the New Atheist movement say, well, the U.S. fucks up all the time, but we're like a benevolent giant trying to do the right thing, and our intentions are great. The response to that is, well, no, because you're kind of ranking U.S. violence and U.S. killing of civilians and terrible, consistent U.S. actions below the bad actions of religious terrorists just because you feel like you should file it there. But that doesn't make sense, like I just said. If you admit that violence for power and control and imperialism and natural resources is more prevalent and just as bad as religious violence, then I think you get a lot of the heat taken off you if you're a new atheist. And by the way, know your U.S. history on it. Like oftentimes Sam Harris will say, well, of course the U.S. has done terrible things in the past. But then he'll go on to, again, talk about how the Islamic fundamentalism is the worst. But it's like you're saying, it's like a brush aside point. No, it's not just the past, it's also right now. We're engaged in fighting in 7 different countries. If I read you the list of countries we've invaded post-World War II, it's a never-ending list. And it wasn't like we were even pretending that there was a humanitarian mission in a majority of the cases. We didn't. For example, the term Banana Republic comes from the fact that we overthrew governments in South America so that Chiquita Banana Company could come in and steal the fucking bananas. We do the same thing in the Middle East with the oil. We have the military-industrial complex where people get rich. They get rich off of war, which is why we sell weapons to everybody, including our enemies, and we're always involved in war. So talk about how imperialist violence can be just as bad as religious violence, and show me that you know what you're talking about and give me facts on that. And hand in hand with that, express support for non-interventionism. Oftentimes there's like some support for it. Where some people in the New Atheist movement, now Bill Maher does this, he's totally off the hook in this one because he is a non-interventionist. But Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens is dead and gone, but he did not agree with non-interventionism. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I also don't think she largely agrees with non-interventionism. But if you're one of the New Atheists, one of the things progressives want, and they're kind of begging for from you, is if you would just tell me that you only believe in state violence when there's an imminent threat of attack against the nation, well, then I would think you're much more reasonable, and I wouldn't attack you nearly as much. I think that's one of the things progressives think. Because, like, for example, when Sam Harris did the podcast with Dan Carlin, and they were going back and forth on the issue of religious terrorism, Dan Carlin brought up state violence and brought up basically U.S. imperialism. And Sam, you could tell that he understands that the U.S. does fucked up stuff and has done fucked up stuff, but it's always like, but the ideal would be, in Sam's mind, that we still should do interventions every once in a while when it's necessary, because that's the moral thing to do. But that's not really true, Sam, because in the real world, people always have ulterior motives. And it's not like we'll always make the decision based off of humanitarian good and altruism. We don't do that. It's naive to think any state would act like that. So then it becomes, we use that as more of a cover to get natural resources and to get more power and control around the world. So just say, I believe in non-interventionism. And again, that's a hard thing for a lot of these people to do because they're, as Cenk would say, and Cenk also fits into this, and I disagree with him, they're mild interventionists. Like, well, if I see every now and then something happens, I'll get involved there. Well, that's not a good idea. You should only use U.S. military strength when there's an imminent threat of attack against the United States. It's a different story if there's some kind of genocide happening somewhere, one side is pure right, one side is pure wrong, and you want the UN to get involved. That's a different conversation, but specifically when the U.S. takes charge and our military does an action, people in the new atheist community should say, we should only do that for self-defense, because we would never accept it if any other nation just decided willy-nilly, well, we're going to be the superpower now, we're going to act. Well, no, we'd say, you can't do that. That's not your role. It's not our role either, okay? We need to be objective in our moral standards and not say that we're the good guys, so we rise above that by definition, and we can act in ways that we wouldn't accept it if other people acted that way. Okay. And finally, the last two things. Stop calling progressives Islamist apologists. Stop calling them that. Now, why do I say that? Now, here's where a lot of new atheists go, well, but you're wrong, Kyle. They are Islamist apologists. But they're not. They're not, and I'll tell you exactly why they're not. Because it's all a matter of how you frame it. So if you say to any of the, progressives here in that camp, so C.J. Werleman, Glenn Greenwald, Noam Chomsky, you could even throw Cenk in there, and all those people. If you frame it to them, hey man, are you for gay marriage? Are you for women's rights? Are you for civil liberties? Are you against theocracy? On every one of those points, they say, of course. Of course I'm for women's rights. Of course I'm for gay rights. Of course I'm against theocracy. So you know that that's their position. But you still call them Islamist apologists. Why? Because they're not criticizing Islamists in the way that you want them to criticize Islamists, where they frame it like, this is directly tied to Islam. Now, I actually agree with tying it to Islam because it does come from the doctrine of Islam. So I agree with new atheists on that point. But it is disingenuous to then say that because they don't criticize it the way I want them to criticize it and connect it to the doctrine of Islam, that therefore they're Islamist apologists. No, if they're still against the individual things, and they are, so they're for women's rights, they're for gay rights, they're for civil liberties, they're against theocracy. If those are their positions, be honest about the fact that that's their position, and then you could have a conversation with them. And you could say, okay, I know you're with me and you just frame it differently, but that's cool. So all of them, whether it's Reza, Aslan, Glenn Greenwald, Noam Chomsky, C.J. Werleman, you name the people in that camp, they're all against Islamists. They are against Islamists. They just don't frame it in the way that you want them to frame it. And understand that there's a distinction there, and they're not like with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. It's fucking ridiculous to think that. And finally, admit, this is to the new atheists here, admit that sometimes the root problem is geopolitics and economics and psychology and oppression, etc. So the progressives say it's always geopolitics, economics, psychology, and oppression that leads to an extreme religious ideology. Whereas the new atheists say it's an extreme religious ideology that leads to the geopolitical problems, the economic problems, the psychological problems, and the oppression, etc. And my main point to both sides is you're both right and you're both wrong because it's a case-by-case thing. So I'll just give a few examples here and we'll wrap it up. But if you look at the Palestinian territories, a lot of new atheists would say, well, the problem is their fucking religion is ass backwards and they want to implement it, and that's why they're living in poverty. That's why the Israelis have to crack down on them. That's why there's all these problems. And my response to that is, no. In that case, the problem actually is the geopolitical situation, the oppression, the economic problems, the poverty, etc. Because they became more religious because they turned to that as the answer when they realized that the secular conditions were so fucked up that they had no hope. And then Hamas comes along and says, well, we got your back, and we're going to fight back against evil occupiers. So come with us and believe in our ideology. And they said anything for us to get a higher standard of living and a better quality of life here. So in that case, the problem is everything else and not the religious ideology. It was the problems that made them turn to the religious ideology. So that's the problem in the Palestinian territories. Now, flip the script, look at some of the Gulf states. So take Saudi Arabia, for example. There, the problem is the opposite. See, there the problem was there was this extreme religious ideology that was developed, and people bought into that ideology. And even when the state is relatively wealthy, they're massively oil rich, even under those scenarios, they still have really backwards, crazy ideas. Now, why is that? Because that's the situation where the religion is the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was not oppression. The heart of the problem was not economics. The heart of the problem was not geopolitics. They had an opportunity. They had wealth, but they embraced a very bad way, primitive way of living, because the religious doctrine itself they believed in, and the doctrine is primitive. Okay? So what's my main point here? My main point is, you're both right and you're both wrong. It just depends on which case you're talking about and which country you're talking about and which situation you're talking about. So, unfortunately, what I see nowadays is the progressives only talk about terrorism when they can point to oppression that led to the radicalization, which led to the terrorism. And all I see is the new atheists talking about instances where it was the religious doctrine itself which was the heart of the problem, which then led to the terrorism. And it wasn't oppression that led to the religious radicalization that led to the terrorism. And if you both would just admit that you're both half right and half wrong, then I think we can move along here and we can stop bitterly attacking each other. But unfortunately, that's likely not going to happen, and I'm probably just talking to myself here. But I wanted to give it one last shot because it pains me to see that people can agree probably on 80% of issues or more and still talk down to each other like the other ones are some kind of buffoons.